hot in my veins. Blue in when I read Whitten, blue in my brain. I'm Bulldog born. Bulldog, that's my breed. I was born to follow where the Bulldogs lead.
Welcome back, everybody, to Inside the Kennel podcast. I think we're doing episode 5. We've got the great man, Dougie Hawkins. Dougie, welcome.
Thank you, Paul.
And Matty, hand it over to you, the co-host. Matty's going to tell us a little bit about what episode's going to look like in Inside the Kennel podcast today.
Absolutely. Well, we've got, and particularly for some of our older viewers, we've got the great Ray Walker, who's going to be on today. Now, that's a name that, some of our younger folks may not be familiar with, but, he's an incredible player who's got, a heck of a story to tell. So we can't wait to hear from Ray. And believe it or not, what club does he come from, Dougie?
Well, boys, he come from the mighty Braybrook Footy Club.
Another
Ray
one.
Walker.
How many from Braybrook?
He's a Braybrook boy, and he's very, very passionate about the Braybrook Football Club. He has family connected there in the Arnells, who were the presidents back in those days. Jack and his brother Gordon Arnell were involved as well. And bloke called, I'm just trying to remember, his name's just eluded me, but it'll come back to me. But he had family connected, obviously, with Braybrook as well. And I got a feeling, did he go down to the Bulldogs in the early 60s?
Yeah, I think it was 1959.
59 he went, did he?
Yeah, that's right. 59. He was there from 59 to 65.
Yep. And I reckon he won a best and fairest. He won a best and fairest. I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah.
Played Victoria.
He played for Victoria, absolutely. He only played 73 games, believe it or not. And
How many did he play? How many played?
73.
73. Yeah, I thought he because funny. I'm being honest here. We talk a lot. Me and Ray, we get on the phone together, and he'll send me a text about this, that's happened, or this has happened, or something's happened to someone. And Ray's always giving me information. Ray Walker, and fantastic bloke. And I remember Ray probably more than Braybrook, obviously, stuff, because I wasn't around then. But he was actually a selector for the Victorian side with Teddy.
Yes.
So I remember seeing Ray, when I played my first game in '82 for Victoria, and Ray was selected back in those days. And he's a very passionate Braybrook person. And you know what? He doesn't like the Bulldogs. He loves the Bulldogs. He's passionate about the Footscray Western Bulldogs Footy Club. He loves to see the club do very, very well. He's a player's man. He loves all the players.
Yeah, well, absolutely. He was a back pocket player. And,
yeah, correct. Correct.
He was a nimble player. He was described as somebody who was tough as nails as well. And if it wasn't for injuries and a little bit of a dip that happened, he probably would have continued playing for Victoria. He dipped out of the side, and then he came back and had a fantastic run towards the end, and ended up I believe heading to Tasmania. He's going to tell us a little bit about that when his interview's in. But his career ended, really abruptly as well. We talked about Clay Smith and a number of others, but also for Ray, for a player, in his mid-20s, and then he took off to Tassie, and I think it was Burnie where he started to captain coach.
That's amazing, Matty, to hear that, Paul, that he'd gone to Tassie. He must have been a very young age, and obviously, you know what he would have probably got. And I'm not saying he's left for that reason, but the monetary could have been enormous.
Like we talk about Brad Hardy winning, a best and fairest out of the back pocket. I guess Ray Walker winning it in 1963 might be the only other back pocket to have, taken it out. It's a hard spot to win it from, I imagine.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because I reckon Gordon Casey, remember Gordon Casey, number 10?
Yes.
He won a best and fairest in the back pocket, I think. Does that sound pretty right, Paul?
Well, we're not to challenge your wisdom, Doug.
No, I'm pretty sure he did. I reckon he won a best and fairest. And I reckon the late Wally Donald, who ended up our half-back in our team of the century, again from Braybrook, Wally Donald, I reckon he might have won a B&F in the back pocket as well.
Maybe the back pocket is the place to be.
Absolutely, but gee, hasn't that position changed? I mean, it doesn't exist anymore, does it? You play in the back pocket.
No,
back in the day,
Brad Hardy, you're right, Paul. You're right, Paul and Matty. I mean, the B Hardy type of players. I mean, he was just so creative from that back pocket. We won 16 games in '85, and the run that he gave for the back pocket was amazing. And yeah, just again going back to the man Ray Walker. great family man, passionate about the Braybrook Footy Club, passionate about the Footscray Western Bulldogs. You wouldn't get a more loyal, genuine, super bloke.
Awesome. Well, Dougie, it's time to say goodbye because I have Ray Walker right now tapping on our door, and we're going to let him in. Thanks again,
See you,
Doug.
Matty. See you, Paul.
Good on you, Dougie. Great
See you
work.
next time.
It's Ray Walker. Welcome, Ray, to the program.
Well, many thanks, Paul. It's a delight to be with you and Matt.
Absolutely, Ray. Well, fantastic. Look, we're going to find out a little bit about your history today, and hopefully our viewers watching are going to learn a thing or two about the 1960s in particular. And for somebody, many years from now, Googling, because your career, correct me if I'm wrong, finished 56 years ago.
Oh, look, don't remind me. It's a long time ago. In fact, when I first started, it was it's like 63 years ago at the age of 17, So It's amazing how the years fly,
Well, to put things in context, Ray, I'm 56, so you finished when I was born.
Is that right?
That seems like a hell of a long time ago.
Yeah, good on you.
So how would you describe yourself as a player for those of us who didn't get to see you in action?
Well, look, I was always a fanatic about the game. In 1956, which was 3 years before I started with the Bulldogs, I was selected to play in the Victorian schoolboys team, which had a carnival down in Launceston, and it was football was just it was my whole life, even from a young age. I had great encouragement. I came out of a magnificent junior club in Braybrook, which from the 1940s produced 30 league players, including 4 members of the Bulldogs team of the century.
Incredible.
And that was Ted Whitten, captain, Doug Hawkins, vice captain, Wally Donald, who was vice captain in our 54 premiership side, and of course Georgie Bissett was the other one. So they had a magnificent record, and I was fortunate enough to be picked up playing with Braybrook's under 18, and the recruiting officer at the time, who was also a committee member, was Bob Turner, who, along with his brother Henry, ran the sports store in Footscray. And ironically enough, Bob Turner's daughter Jackie ended up marrying Alex Gardner, who was one of our stars back in the 60s and played in our 61 grand final side.
Ray, tell us about, I hear so much through Dougie, and I believe you've got a great story about him you can share later on, but what was so wonderful about the Braybrook Footy Club, because you're taking it even way back before Dougie, who speaks very highly of it. Were most clubs like that, or was Braybrook an exceptional club that just had great committee members or great presidents? Can you tell us about what made it a special place?
Well, Braybrook, how would I describe it? It had a fantastic person by the name of Jim Middleton, and Jim played with Footscray back in the VFA days, and then went to Williamstown, and he was there right through that 40s and coached Ted Whitten and Wally Donald, and had a huge impact on the careers of myself and Georgie Bissett, who came along later, obviously, and also Doug Hawkins. So much so that the club rooms were actually named in his honour. And so he was a legend of the club, but as a result of that, he attracted good people around him as well. And one of those that was with Braybrook initially was captain of Footscray back in the 1920s and led them to 3 premierships, a chap called Johnny Craddock. And so there's always been a legacy there at Braybrook, right through its history. It's hard to believe because, you had good district league teams. You had Sunshine that was in the Metropolitan League and then the VFA. But for some reason or other, people wanted to play at Braybrook.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And, you say 30 league footballers from Braybrook, but, possibly 2 of the Bulldogs' absolute greatest of all-time players are from Braybrook. Both of them have their own statues in their honour.
That's right. Well, the statues went up at the Braybrook hotel, which leads me to tell you this little story about Doug. He's one of the statues. But Doug used to like a drink when he was about 14, 15, 16. And the publican owner at the time used to kick him out of the hotel. And he couldn't believe many years later that there was a statue in his honour outside the Braybrook Hotel, along with Ted Whitten, you know. But Doug's still a famous idol at Braybrook.
Oh, absolutely, certainly is. So tell us how you came to be or join the club. I imagine it's a rite of passage being around the corner in Braybrook. So when they identified you as a talented player, was that always just on the cards that you'd naturally wind up at Footscray?
Well, probably. I mean, in those days, where you lived was where you played, pretty much in league ranks. I'd played under 16 and under 18 football at Braybrook and had won the league best and fairest in the under 16s and under 18s. And Bob Turner was then the recruiting officer for Footscray. He and his brother Henry ran the sports store in Footscray. And Bob's daughter Jackie actually married one of our star players in Alex Gardner, who played in our 61 grand final side, a dashing winner. And so it was about 6 weeks before the end of the season, the under-18s in 1959, that Bob saw me playing in a game in the under-18s against Parkside and invited me to go down to train at Footscray. And as a result, I played 4 games in the reserves and the last 2 games in the seniors in the 59 season. I was 17 at the time. It was a tough initiation because my first game was against Collingwood, who had come off winning the premiership in 58. They were a fearsome side. And they drew big crowds, as you know. And my first game was at the Western Oval, and there was 34,000 people there. And my opponents on the day was the great Thorol Merritt, who's in the Collingwood's team of the century. And the other rover was Errol Hutchison, who went on to be a board member at Collingwood. And the next game was the final game of the season, playing against Essendon. And my opponents that day, the 2 rovers, were Jack Clark, who'd moved from the centre, and also John Burt, who later became reserves coach for 7 years at the Bulldogs.
Wow.
So it was a pretty tough baptism. And then I was able to go back and play with Braybrook in the grand final in the under-18s in the same year.
Ray, I was talking to Matty prior to the program saying, I was talking about my father who played in the 60s in the Golden Valley, and he used to tell stories of great players who would just go down and play in the VFL for 2 weeks or a week or reserves, and that it was a different sort of structure back then. So you're telling me that as a 17-year-old, you left Braybrook, you played 4 games in the reserves, then you're put into the seniors. Did the VFL clubs at that stage have a list? Were they allowed to just bring anybody in? You said you went back, which is a very uncommon practice, obviously, these days.
Well, I went back with the intention of playing with the Bulldogs the next season because Footscray hadn't made the finals that year in 59. And so it was just an automatic arrangement to go back and play in the finals.
And did you have to get a permit, or were they allowed to play any number of people, or was there a finite amount of...
I think there was a permanent arrangement, Paul, back in those days, yes, as I understand it.
So Ray, what was it like then as a 17-year-old walking in to Whitten Oval or Western Oval as it was at the time? It was only 5 years prior to that the Bulldogs had won the flag. So, there were some great names there. What was it like as a kid walking in and seeing those famous faces?
Well, sadly, many of those from the 54 premiership side, for various reasons, had actually left the club. And when I came down in 59, there was only 3 players remaining from the 54 premiership. That was Ted Whitten, of course, Jimmy Gallagher, who I replaced in the back pocket and was a star halfback flanker in our 54 premiership side. And the third one was Arthur Edwards. And Arthur's father-in-law was a famous Footscray name by the name of Frank Dolly Aiken, who played with the Bulldogs back in the 1930s and then became a trainer for many years at the club.
Wow. So there was that much of a mass exodus. I realised that a number of players had left, but I didn't realise it was, like 18 or 19 players.
It was huge.
Wow.
It was huge. I mean, it's just hard to believe, isn't it? That would happen within 5 years.
And what was the reasoning behind that, Ray? Was there were they taken to other clubs? Did they retire?
Well, I think that Alan Martin, for example, was an outstanding halfback flanker, and he went back into the Bendigo League. That was just one example. But there were many others that left before they were finished in league football, which was sad, really, at the time. So whether it was an administration problem, I'm not sure. But Don Ross was another one. He was an outstanding centreline player. Peter Box had a falling out with the club and left, and was a brilliant Brownlow medalist. So there was many cases like that. Roger Duffy went to Canberra, and it was very confusing to see that happen so quickly.
Yeah, so I guess that brought with it though some opportunities. So you walking in as a young kid, and I guess the list looking to refresh and turn their form into something that it was previously. And it, I guess a couple of years later, you obviously made the grand final again. But what was that opportunity like when you walked in?
Well, it was awe-inspiring, really, because having gone to the club after representing the Victorian schoolboys back in '56, to then just 2 or 3 years later have the opportunity of training with absolute champions. I mean, to see Ted Whitten as then captain and coach training in his Victorian jumper was just awe-inspiring. And he had people like John Schultz who joined the club in 1958, and both Whitten and Schultz won 5 Brownlow medalists between them. In fact, John Schultz, in the first 10 years of his league career, was never out of the Victorian side. And there's only one other person who's ever done that, and that was Fred Flanagan, who captained Geelong to their premierships in 1952 and 52.
Wow. That's brilliant.
It's a wonderful record. And then John served brilliantly on the tribunal for 25 years. He's one of our 7 Hall of Famers. I'm pleased to say that I'm one of the 5 Hall of Fame selectors, and we have absolute champions of that 7, including Schultz and Whitten, people like Chris Grant, Alan Hopkins, a star back in the 30s, Norman Ware, just 7 absolute champions of the club.
Wow.
Ray, what sort of wisdoms did those sort of players pass on to you? I mean, verbally, and I guess watching them play, what did you learn from them? What did they say to you?
Look, I think it was just encouragement more than anything else. I can recall in my first game, not a lot, but Arthur Edwards was in the opposite back pocket to myself as the change ruckman, and I can still remember his words of encouragement in the club rooms before the game. And as I mentioned, he was one of only 3 that had played in the '54 premiership that was still there. And I think also the bond with Whitten was strong because having come from the same junior club. In fact, in those days, Footscray on its list had about 2/3 of its senior lineup that came out of the district league. So, we were playing against each other in the under-16s and under-18s, and then forming the nucleus of the senior team.
Incredible. And so tell us a bit about your bond with Charlie Sutton as well. Like his playing career had come to an end, I presume, by the time you'd arrived.
Well, Charlie was just an amazing character. He was there on every training night. He was an absolute legend of the club. And we had 2 others like him. The reserves coach at the time was, Joey Ryan was around the club as well.
Yep.
He was a champion back in the 1940s. Roy Evans was an absolute pearler. He became the reserves coach, and just an absolute outstanding individual, Roy Evans. he was the captain of our first finals team back in the 1930s. And those sort of people just helped rebuild the club. They were just absolutely outstanding individuals, you know.
Unreal. And around that time, you know, it didn't take you very long for you to be a bit of a juggernaut there. I understand that you played for Victoria very early on in your career.
Well, my first state game, would you believe, was against Tasmania.
Huh.
And it was in 1960. I'd only played a handful of league games, and I was selected in the back pocket to go down and play against Tasmania in 1960. And it was the first time, would you believe, that Tasmania had ever beaten Victoria. And I was 19th man because the captain of the team was the famous Carlton back pocket player, and captain of that team was Bruce Combat.
Oh, wow.
And the vice captain was Murray Whitten from Collingwood. Some very good players in it. But Tassie, a little story about that particular game. It was on the holiday Monday in June, and Darryl Bulldog, at the age of 19, had been appointed captain of Tasmania. That's how good he was. On the Saturday before the Monday game, his mother had passed away, and so he pulled out of the game. And who should take his place as captain and coach but Stuart Spencer, who at the age of 25 had won 2 Best and Fairest with Melbourne. And through his wife's business, a huge family transport business called Green's Transport, he was appointed coach of Clarence in Hobart and became an absolute champion down there, as he was with Melbourne. And he came in as captain and coach and was best of field, absolutely dominated the game.
Wow. Awesome. And what was that experience like for you as a young kid, 18 or 19, running out with these absolute champions? What was the experience like?
Well, it was sort of awe-inspiring. I mean, it's a lot to take in at just 18 years of age, but it was a great thrill, you know, to be part of the Big V.
Also,
Ray, tell us about the back pocket position, because again, Matty and I were talking about this with Dougie around the back pocket a position that doesn't exist anymore. And I know even from, you know, mentioning it now that there's so many great back pocket players. What did you have to do back in those days? What was a great back pocket player and what were the characteristics?
Well, Paul, in those days, as you say, it was unusual by today's standards, but the league teams had 2 fine rovers. You know, the ruck rovers were almost unheard of until the likes of Huey Mitchell and Ron Barassi came along. So you always were up against 2 very, very good players in that era. People like Alan Aylett at North Melbourne. Fitzroy was interesting because Len Smith, the brother of Norm Smith, took over at Fitzroy, and he had this merry-go-round football area, and they'd have about 4 or 5 different players changing on you, you know. And he was before his time, Len Smith, but he was very highly regarded. But there was some wonderful players. I mentioned John Burt's name, Alan Aylett at North Melbourne. Then Billy Goggin came along at Geelong, and Ian Law at Hawthorn, who had played for Victoria and also represented Victoria in cricket, was another one. So you always had your work cut out because they invariably had not just one good rover like Bob Skelton, but McGowan was his understudy, and they were both very good players, you know. Bob Skelton, of course, winning 3 Brownlow medals.
And was the concept back then, of course, Ray, that was the resting rover. So you'd get the resting rover who would have been on the ball to come back. And I guess back then they were also, depending on who they are, very able at kicking goals. So it was very important, I guess, to shut them down, was it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without question. Without question. And as I mentioned, the sides did have 2 very good rovers. So they were a pinnacle part of, you know, the makeup of the team.
So what was the art? Tell us a little bit about what you were good at, Ray, in a sense of what were your strengths? Was it turning on a dime? Was it punching from behind?
Well, my strength was marking. You know, I could compete better than most at overhead marking. And that was a tribute to a former coach in Jim Middleton, because he recognised that strength from an early time. And he set up this marking machine in this big backyard of his in Braybrook. And I used to go every week down there to practice. He also recognised the fact that, and in those days, there wasn't the same emphasis on pace as there is today. But he did recognise that from an early stage. And he had myself and George Bissett doing pre-season training. He made running blocks for us to train. And that led to doing pre-season training under a famous trainer of athletes in Fergie Speakman, who won 5 store gifts through him. And George Bissett and I used to train under him over at Ascot Vale. He became a prominent committee member also at Essendon in that era.
Wow. That's incredible, and that's echoed in the Football Encyclopedia here. That describes you. Despite you not being the tallest player, you're an incredibly great mark. But it also said you just had footy nous.
That's being kind.
And Ray, I've got no doubt you were probably the gentleman as well, or was it a little bit more feisty back in those days when you could get away with things?
Well, there were certainly a lot of feisty footballers around, as you know. I mean, Ted Whitten got knocked out in his first game by Don Fraser, who missed 84 games through suspension.
Wow.
So there was a few of those characters around. When you played against Hawthorn, you had to come up against a guy called Des Dixon. And when you played down at South Melbourne, they had Ken Boyd. And these guys were absolutely, they'd go to the nth degree to knock you out,
Hey, Ray, you're from Braybrook. So they breed them tough in Braybrook. I would have thought you'd be able to sort that out.
Well, there were tougher blokes at Braybrook than me, and at Footscray as well. But you learn to toughen up pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ray, with getting back to the Bulldogs, what was the distinction between being a Bulldog and being a Carlton player, being an Essendon player? Were there distinctions back in those days, or was everyone the same, no matter where you come from? These days, obviously, you have Melbourne, who are the skiers on the weekend, and you have the Carlton, who are Lygon Street. And
yeah, sure.
Was it similar back then?
Yes, it was. Footscray was seen as the working man's club. Because most of the industry in those days came out of the western suburbs. I mean, it was just a fact of life. And so a lot of our players did it hard, in terms of their own working lives, plumbers and tradesmen and that sort of thing. So it was always a club that sort of battled hard. I mean, I spoke, I became a state selector for 6 years. And when you spoke to people like Alan Jeans and David Parkin, they used to loathe coming out to the Western Oval because you'd get that huge, strong wind coming down to the Geelong Road end, and you'd bottle the game up in that pocket, on the outer wing, the Doug Hawkins wing. And it was a minefield for visiting clubs to play at Footscray.
And there's great stories about, turning on the sprinklers and making sure the opposition change rooms. We just had cold water. Is that an actual fact?
Well, I can vouch for the cold showers, but the worst team for sprinkling water on the ground before the match was St Kilda. You'd go down to Moorabbin, and the other grounds were dry, and St Kilda would deliberately water the ground during the week.
I think that was going right into the 80s and 90s, I believe, Ray. I think that's like a club tradition.
I think that's true too.
Now, Ray, I really want to ask you. So you've touched on playing for Victoria. You must have an absolute full head of steam and confidence moving into the 1961 season, and we know that it eventuates in the club reaching a grand final. Can you tell us about that campaign, not only from a club perspective, but also you as an individual?
Well, from an individual point of view, it was a bit of a disaster for me because pre-season I unfortunately, at the Western Oval, I suffered a serious eye injury. And as a result, I had bleeding behind the right eye for about 2 months. And as a result, I missed pre-season training right up to the first half of the year. And Charlie Evans came in and had a magnificent period where he also represented Victoria in the back pocket. And so he was my replacement at the time. I eventually came back midway through the season, missing the pre-season training. I was struggling for form and fitness. Yeah. And on the eve of the finals, I was dropped. And Barry Ian came in to take my place and played so well in the finals that he held his position. Wow. So that was the story of 61. But 61, as you know, was a great era for the club. In fact, I think the next year there was about 5 or 6 from that team actually represented Victoria, and it was a tremendous year, as you know.
Ray, with this, again, getting back to those positions, this is a time when those positions were fairly static, weren't they? So, like you said, if someone came in and filled in when you're injured and played really well in the back pocket, there was more of a leniency towards, oh well, you're just going to have to wait, or were there other positions on the field that you could compete for?
Well, I think most of the positions were pretty much taken up. The players that were in those positions were very good players. I mean, we had Graham Ian was an outstanding half forward flanker. John Gillard represented Victoria, one of best and fairest as a half back flanker. Alex Gardner was an outstanding winger. Ian Bryant was on the other wing, and eventually when I moved to Tasmania, took my place in the back pocket and became an All-Australian back pocket player. So the quality was there, and of course you had the leadership of both Whitten and Schultz, who were quite outstanding, you know, as well.
And look, you won back your position, obviously, because you went on to great heights in 1963. Tell us about your return to top class form and how you ended up winning the Charlie.
Well, it was a tremendous change, you know, in my own good fortunes. As I mentioned to you, I actually got myself very fit. I did a huge pre-season training under Fergie Speakman, the well-known athletics coach. And George Bissett actually came down and joined the club as well that year. He'd played in the under-19s prior to that. And we both went on to, you know, have an outstanding career, although mine was all briefly compared to George, as you know, played over 200 league games and made the Bulldogs team of the century. So everything just clicked in place in 61. There's no question about that. We had a wonderful final series.
Ray, with that additional work that you did pre-season, did you guys sort of go and sort your own sort of fitness levels? So these days, obviously, it's all mandated by the club. It sounds like back in your day, if you wanted to do that extra stuff, you'd go find your sprint coach, or was that the case?
Yeah, pretty much. You know, we had people like Des Tuddenham was one that did it. Bobby Skilton was another one. Len Thompson. So you did what you thought was best for you if you wanted to really go that extra mile. And that's in fact what happened. Bob Spargo was another one that was very heavily involved. He made the final of the store gift, which his father had done previously, and his younger brother Ricky had done. 3 from the one family. Quite extraordinary.
I think they're a relation to the Spargo that plays at Melbourne, I believe. Is that right? I think so.
That's the son of Paul.
Yes.
So it's 1, 2, 3 generations. 4 generations. Quite extraordinary.
So your training at Aberfeldy Park must have absolutely paid off, because you're playing with Whitten and Schultz, and here you are, you know, as a young man in his early 20s, winning the best and fairest. What an achievement.
Well, it was a great thrill. It was a great thrill. In fact, people make a joke of the fact. They said, what was wrong with Whitten and Schultz in 63? Were they injured? And I had to assure them they weren't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what an incredible feat. And, as Dougie points out, there's another best and fairest for Braybrook.
Yeah, well, I think at one stage we had about 9 best and fairest winners, including 5 from EJ, of course, and then we had Georgie Bissett won one, and myself and Dougie Hawkins as well.
Gee, Ray, there mustn't be any space on the walls at the Braybrook Footy Club, surely.
Yeah, it's got a wonderful record, Paul, and I think a lot of it was due. They had some outstanding junior coaches. I was coached by a chap called Ted Hanson, that had been a leading goal kicker for Seddon in the Footscray District League, and he'd moved to North Sunshine and took up the coaching role at under 16, under 18 level, and he was with me right through that period. I was at the Sunshine High School, where we had 4 from the high school playing league football at Footscray. There was myself and George Bissett. There was another understudy to John Schultz in the ruck by the name of Nils Becker, and he became the professor of mathematics at the Canberra University, and as a result his career was shortened. And the other one was Bobby Gray, that also was at school with me. Bob sadly has passed on, but he was a very good halfback flanker for the club as well.
So I'm just trying to picture you, and hearing your descriptions here. Who would you compare yourself to as a modern Bulldog? Are you a sort of a Taylor Duray type player who can take a marks, athletic?
Yeah, possibly. I think the best defender I've seen over the 50 years that I've been involved with the Bulldogs would be Dale Morris. I've never seen anyone like Morris that can play on a short, on a tall, medium-sized player. David Young, who was his osteopath, I took my son down to be trained. He had a knee injury at one stage, and he actually down in Windsor, he looks after top sporting people from any sport around the world, and he said he's never seen anyone like Morris who's able to play with injuries and recover from injuries as well as he has. He said he's quite an exceptional individual. And I was always disappointed when we lost Dale Morris and Matthew Boyd as additions to our match committee. They're 2 absolutely outstanding individuals from our premiership, as you know.
Yeah, and Dale was like the Terminator, wasn't he? I've seen like a graphic of all the injuries he had in his body, including his broken vertebrae, and he just turned up each and every game. So are you telling me, did you make a link a little bit of that? Is there a bit of Dale Morris in you? Yeah,
possibly. I always played very close. I was able to generally keep the Rovers in check. I was probably a better mark than Dale, but
tell him you said that.
Well, he had many other attributes that I didn't have. I think he was just an outstanding, not only player, but an individual, And I was very sad to see him go from the match committee when COVID came in and they had to pull a couple out. Matthew Boyd, sadly, is now part of Fremantle's match committee. I would have loved to have seen those 2 guys back, supporting Luke Beveridge.
Ray, tell us about being on the match committee. So you're a selector for Victoria. You're a selector for the Bulldogs. So what sort of problems or scenarios did you have to look at to select a particular player for a particular position or particular players for a particular game? What was it, a long process? Did you have a lot of 1 o'clock in the morning type of scenario?
Well, I served for 6 years under 3 outstanding league coaches, 2 years with Alan Jeans, 2 years with Kevin Sheedy, and 2 years with David Parkin. And then after I'd served those 6 years, I got approached by a chap called Jim Oliver, whose father was Arthur Oliver, the games holder before Ted Whitten at the Bulldogs. And he said, would I be interested in coming back as chairman of selectors under Michael Malthouse? So I served under Mick for 3 years in 87, 8 and 9. They weren't glory years for the club because, as you know, we'd made the finals earlier on under In fact, very unlucky not to play in a grand final under
85, yeah.
Whitehouse.
Mm.
And so I spent the 3 years there. And we were struggling at the time. We never had a lot of outstanding players. Tony McGuinness had come across. He and Brian Raw were the Rovers. Doug Hawkins was probably in the twilight of his career. Simon Beasley was outstanding, as you know, as a full forward. But apart from that, we had a pretty struggling side, and it was hard work. And there were long hours involved in sitting down to pick the teams. But the experience of being a state selector for 6 years, I think, held me in good stead. And I certainly enjoyed that part of football, being involved in the administration side.
As a state selector, Ray, what when you've got a plethora of magnificent players sitting on a page in front of you, how do you pick the team when you've got so much talent?
Yeah, well, we had sort of pretty astute people around us. People like Len Thompson. Ian Ridley was chairman of selectors, just an outstanding individual from successful years at Melbourne, of course. And Ted Whitten, he sort of made state football, as you know. So there was a lot of wise counsel there. And then the coaches themselves, I mean, they were very successful. They'd won multiple premierships, the three of them. So there was plenty of support. And of course, you had the best of players playing for it in Victoria. I remember one story was Gary Ablett. Gary Ablett had come down from the Ovens and Murray. Bill McMaster, well-known Geelong player, became their recruiting manager. And they had to overcome a debt that he'd accrued at Myrtleford. Anyway, they finally got him to Geelong. And he'd only played a handful of games. And Ted Whitten was the major commentator on K-Rock, the Geelong football station. And Alan Jones was coach. And every week, Ted would throw up this name of Gary Ablett, who'd only played, a handful of league games at the time. And Alan Jones said, "Ted, don't sell me an Ablett. He's caused us too much trouble. No, I won't play him in the Victorian side." Anyway, finally, Jones, who was as determined as what Ted was, held out. Anyway, Jones finally relented, and we took him to Perth to play against Western Australia. We started him on the half-forward flank in his first state game after a handful of league games. In 3 quarters, he'd kicked 6 goals. And we had problems at full forward. We moved him to full forward at 3-quarter time. And he kicked another 2. 8 goals in the state side. And ironically enough, one of the guys who beat us on the post by 4 points, kicked 7 goals for WA, was Gary Buckenara.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember that game fondly, Ray. He just blew it away, didn't he? It was just remarkable to see a player dominate. And I do recall that he didn't have a lot of games under his belt because he was originally at Hawthorn with his brother, which is probably why Jeansy wasn't so keen on him.
No, well, Jeansy had a lot of problems with Gary Ablett. When he only played a half a dozen games or something at Hawthorn.
The motto of that story is listen to EJ. If he says pick him, because it's incredible. What a pure era to be watching state footy when you've got those sort of players running around and Buckenara at the other end putting on a show as well. So now, Ray, we've missed a little chunk. We moved from you playing to becoming a state selector. How was it that your career, at a ripe age in your mid-20s, come to a conclusion so abruptly?
Well, my father was owner of a big property in Braybrook. It was about 11 or 12 acres. He was a pig breeder of all things. 5,000 it was, and I was 23 at the time, and he'd taken ill. My older brother had came in to manage the property, and I'd gone down to help out. It was hard work, cleaning out pigsties at 4 o'clock in the morning. And by the time I got to training, I was basically stuffed. And I did this for half a season, and my form fell away. And I said to the family members, I said, listen, I still want to continue playing football. Anyway, I picked up the midweek Sporting Globe, came out on a Wednesday, the pink paper, and there was a position advertised as captain and coach of the Burnie Football Club. And having been involved in such a strong club as Braybrook, I was keen to, still continue in the game. Mid-season, I applied for the coaching role. Alistair Lord, who'd won the Brownlow medal for Geelong 2 years earlier, had decided to leave Geelong and had gone down to be captain and coach of Burnie. They wouldn't clear him. He sat on the bench for half the season. And then halfway through the season, unbeknownst to the Burnie Football Club, he decided to disappear and played with Geelong on the next Saturday.
Oh.
They were left without a captain and coach.
Oh.
I applied for the coaching role, as I said, mid-season, and was duly appointed. Wow. And it opened up so many opportunities by making that move. I played state football for Tasmania for 4 years, including the Australian National Football Championships in 1966, of which Peter Hudson was a member of the Tasmanian team. The next year he came to Hawthorn. The next year I won the Lefroy medal for Victoria's best player against Victoria. And it led to being captain and coach of the Burnie Football Club to a premiership in 66. And about that time I was becoming engaged, and Bev and I were going to spend the first 3 years of our marriage in Tasmania, which blew out to 11 when I joined Ansett Airlines. So going to Tasmania meant a 20-year career with Ansett, but also a 20-year career with the ABC, starting with Tim Lane in Launceston, who's still going strong.
Wow. So isn't it amazing that just the direction, the sliding doors of your career and how things, just panned out incredibly well. And, if you to have that sort of storied career in Tassie and then become a commentator, that's quite phenomenal.
It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing.
Ray, what was the standard like? I mean, you've gone from the VFL, the best competition in the country. You've gone, and obviously there was an attraction there if you're talking about Lloyd going there and that desperately that he's prepared to sit out a VFL career. What was the standard like, and what position did you play, and what was it like being a coach?
You're talking about Tasmanian days?
Yes, yes.
Look, as you know, Tasmania was a wonderful feeding ground for the VFL, as it was in those days, to Melbourne. And you had 3 major leagues, and they were all strong leagues. And there wasn't a lot of money around in league football. I was at Footscray for 5 years and went from £8 a game to £10 a game. And people were going to Tasmania for coaching roles in their prime in league football for £60 a game after getting £10 playing league football.
Jeez.
So Tasmania became a big attraction, as did country Victoria, like the Ovens and Murray. Players like Bob Rose, Bill Stephen ended up at the Ovens and Murray in their prime. And similarly, I took over from Alistair Lord at Burnie, and then took over from Fred Wooler, who'd captained Geelong in the 63 premiership side at Penguin. And as you know, the greats have come from down there: Croswell, Bulldog, Ian Stewart, Peter Hudson, Barry Lawrence. You could just keep going on and on. It was a wonderful breeding ground. And Tasmania local football has now suffered since the arrival of North Melbourne and Hawthorn, because all the emphasis is on AFL football down there.
Which leads to the question, Ray, do you believe they should have a club, and do you believe what the AFL are trying to orchestrate at the moment with the stadium is the right way to go? What are your thoughts around that?
I think the stadium is far over the top. The 2 stadiums they've currently got for North Melbourne in Hobart and for Hawthorn in Launceston, they can both be upgraded. And the huge cost of putting a massive new stadium in Hobart is just ridiculous. Tasmania football is now struggled locally because of the advent of North Melbourne and Hawthorn going down there, which all the locals follow their league teams now. And as a result, there's $20 million going every year to have Hawthorn and North Melbourne sponsored in Tasmania, and that's $20 million that's lost to local football. It's been an absolute goldmine for Hawthorn and also North Melbourne.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Ray, I see you in social media quite regularly. There's lots of posts about the Past Players Association, and you seem to be, at all the events and spoken so highly about from the past players. The club obviously means a heck of a lot to you, all these years later. What does Footscray Footy Club represent to you and the Western Bulldogs?
Well, look, it represents everything. I go to every home game in Melbourne. We've got probably one of the most outstanding Past Players Association, which is recognised by other clubs. Ross Abbey has come in as the president. He's done a magnificent job. The delegate from our past players to the AFL Past Players Association is Jack Slattery. Jack's a neighbour of mine in Vermont, and he, along with a number of others like them, have really made it such an outstanding organisation. And it attracts many of the players back. We have now many past players living in other states, and so many of our past players, a committee, always go to interstate games and meet up with colleagues that played with them at Footscray. So the bonding there is quite something. My son is an avid Bulldog supporter, and we had five or six family members at our premiership win, and he became a statistician at the club during the Michael Malthouse period and continued on with my involvement with the state team. So we've had a great bond. He's now in his mid-50s, and I just love going along to, Marvel Stadium to catch up with the guys. It's a great bonding exercise.
Oh, it looks like it, certainly. And did you happen to get a ticket for the grand final in 2016 then?
Well, we were very lucky. We had six family members sitting together.
Oh,
including a guy called Kevin Saunders. Kevin Saunders, would you believe, is a Catholic priest from Adelaide, and his grandfather played with the Bulldogs back in the 1890s. And
wow.
He became, after being a player, a coach, and then a head trainer, had a 50-year span with the Bulldogs. This is some of the history of the club. And so he joined us, obviously. He was living in Melbourne at the time. He was the house manager for down at the Catholic students at Monash University. And he'd been the football manager for Blackfriars in Adelaide. Got in touch with me and said he was coming over to play against Whitefriars as coach of Blackfriars, where Patrick Lipinski went to here in Melbourne. And he wanted to know whether I could get hold of Malcolm Malthouse to come out and talk to the players. But at the stage, Mike was unavailable and Terry Wallace was playing with the club. And he said that was the opening for him to eventually coach Footscray. He agreed to go and coach the side on that particular occasion,
Wow.
So that's part of the memories I've got.
Oh, you've mentioned so many players. When you're sitting in the grandstand watching a grand final, and these past players are all around you, and you're seeing the success. Most of you, there's only 42 players in the history of the club who have got a premiership medallion. And something like 990 odd that haven't. Do you feel a sense of pride when you're watching that and say, actually, I'm part of this, and part of my story is us getting getting the flag?
Yes, well, I do. I mean, as you know, we came into the league in 25, so we're less than 100 years old. But when you go back through the history of the club, it's got a very proud history, even though we've only won 2 premierships. You know, some of the people have gone through the club. I think we've lost about 4 or 5 Brownlow medalists, haven't we, the journey?
Yeah.
Gary Round and Gary Dempsey and
Wilson,
Quinlan and Templeton. You know, it's just been a tragedy, really. It's all part of our history.
Brad Hardy as well. Yeah, another back pocket. There you are. See,
another back pocket.
That's where the gold is. Now, just before we leave you, Ray, we love to sort of end with a little bit of a sort of a game or a little bit of a light-hearted activity. It's called the Bulldog Brain Quiz. Now, as a part of this quiz, we put 60 seconds on the clock. Sorry to put you under pressure here without any pre-warning, all right? So, but we do give you a little bit of power here because we'd like you to choose the category, all right? I'm going to give you 2 categories and you can select which one you'd prefer to have, all right? So you can either choose Bulldog first games, okay, or the 1960s.
I'd probably have to go for the 1960s.
Brilliant.
Now, Ray, sorry, Matty, Ray, this is where depends how you go. We've had prior people, our guests, do this particular quiz, and we put you on a little ascendancy order, a little order. So if we hope that you end up, we take your name and put it at the very top after this quiz.
I don't know what that means.
Good luck. Well, Doug Hawkins is at the top of the list. He's got the highest points. Let's see if you can challenge him. All right. So 60 seconds is up on the clock, Ray. Good luck. Your time starts now. Jack Collins was club president in the late 1960s. True or false?
True.
Footscray led the 1961 grand final at halftime. True or false?
True.
Bulldogs won more than 50% of their games during the 1960s. Is that true or false?
Probably false.
False, 36%. How many night premierships did the Dogs win in the 60s?
I'd say 4.
3. Who won the 1969 Charles Sutton medal?
69 was Georgie Bissett.
Yeah, your old mate. What iconic structure at the Barclay Street end was pulled down in 1966?
Well, that was the old stand, wasn't it?
The Cowshed's Pavilion, indeed.
Cowshed, yeah.
Bushfires restricted which started 2 games in 1969?
Which bushfires? I think there was one at the St Kilda ground.
Which player was affected by it?
No, sorry.
Dempsey. Final question, just as the time stops there. Final question, we'll get it to go. The 1960s saw only 2 Bulldog coaches, Ted Whitten and which other coach?
1960 would probably be Bob Rose, was it?
1960s, I'm saying. So there were 2 coaches.
Sorry, 1960s probably would have been Charlie Sutton.
You got it. Nailed. Fantastic.
Well done, Ray. That's a good effort.
Indeed. So we'll total up those scores and it's coming up on your screen in a moment. You're certainly challenging Dougie there with that effort. Well done.
Just to give you, Ray, just to make you feel a bit better, Dougie's questions are a hell of a lot easier than the ones that we just provided you. Then I can assure you.
Is that right?
You did beautifully.
Yeah.
Now, Ray, we want to thank you for the bottom of our hearts for joining us today. You're just a charming and a fantastic encyclopedia of Bulldog knowledge there from an era that preceded myself. Just love to hear those stories, and I know the fans are going to really be enthralled by hearing that. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much to both of you, because I sense you're both fanatical Bulldogs people, and it's a great joy to share some thoughts with you today.
And Ray, I think it's a great history lesson for our listeners, particularly our younger listeners, to understand that football wasn't. Yet it's the same, but it's different. It wasn't always about money. It wasn't always about wealth. It was about real life, and that sometimes you made decisions around what's best for your family. And the VFL wasn't all, wasn't the be all of everything, definitely at all. So was good to hear that history and understanding from your era.
And I think Footscray too has got such a proud history. Goes back to 1883. It's a unique club. It really is. People like a stockbroker like Simon Beasley. Took to Footscray like a fish out of water. I mean, it's quite extraordinary his contribution both on and off the field. So it caters for everyone.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the word Simon said when we interviewed him as well, Ray. He said the same thing. So, Ray, stick around. We want to chat to you post-interview, but thank you very much, and we really appreciate your time and effort.
Thanks very
Ladies
much.
and gentlemen,
Thanks, Ray.
Ray Walker.
Red in my heart,
Thank you.
white in my veins, blue in what I read, white and blue in my brain. I'm Bulldog born.